There is a quiet assumption that governs much of human experience, so deeply embedded that it rarely invites question. The belief that to see is to understand. From the moment we first open our eyes as children, the world rushes toward us in color, shape, motion, and form, and we learn, quickly, almost instinctively, to trust what appears before us. Vision becomes our primary language of reality, a constant stream of information that feels immediate, undeniable, and true. Yet beneath this certainty lies a paradox so subtle that it often goes unnoticed. The very tool we rely on most to perceive reality may also be the one that limits it most profoundly. To say, "Stop using your eyes," is not a rejection of sight, but an invitation to reconsider what sight truly means. It is a statement that carries a quiet disruption, a gentle fracture in the surface of assumption. For, if reality were fully accessible through vision alone, there would be no mystery left to explore, no depth beyond the visible, no hidden architecture waiting to be uncovered. And yet, throughout history, there have been whispers, across philosophy, science, and spirituality, that what we perceive is not the whole, but a filtered interpretation, a rendering shaped as much by the mind as by the external world. Imagine for a moment that reality is not a static landscape, but a layered field, like a vast ocean whose surface reflects light while its depths remain unseen. The eyes, in this metaphor, skim the surface, capturing reflections, movements, and patterns that appear coherent and complete. But beneath that surface lies an intricate world of currents, pressures, and forms that cannot be grasped through sight alone. To rely solely on vision is to mistake the surface for the entirety, to believe that what is illuminated is all that exists. The caution embedded in the phrase "watch carefully" suggests that this exploration is not without consequence. To question perception is to step into uncertainty, to loosen the grip of familiar frameworks that provide stability and orientation. It is to acknowledge that the world we have come to know may be, in some sense, a constructed experience, a collaboration between sensory input and cognitive interpretation. This realization does not diminish reality, rather, it expands it, revealing that there are dimensions of experience that lie beyond the immediate reach of the eyes. There is a growing understanding, even within modern science, that perception is not a passive reception of data, but an active process of interpretation. The brain does not simply record what the eyes see. It organizes, filters, and sometimes even alters that information based on prior knowledge, expectations, and internal states. In this sense, what we see is not a direct window into reality, but a carefully curated representation, shaped by both external stimuli and internal patterns. The eyes provide the raw material, but it is the mind that constructs the image. This raises a profound question. If our perception is mediated, then what lies beyond that mediation? What aspects of reality remain obscured not because they are hidden, but because we have not developed the capacity to perceive them differently? To stop using your eyes is to begin exploring alternative modes of awareness, to shift attention from the external to the internal, from the visible to the felt, from the immediate to the underlying. There is a subtle but significant difference between looking and seeing. Looking is an act of direction, a movement of attention toward an object. Seeing, in its deeper sense, is an act of understanding, a recognition that arises not only from what is observed, but from how it is integrated within awareness. It is possible to look at something without truly seeing it, just as it is possible to perceive something without directly looking at it. This distinction becomes the threshold through which a different kind of perception begins to emerge. In many contemplative traditions, there is an emphasis on inner vision, a form of perception that does not rely on the physical eyes but on a more expansive awareness. This is not a mystical abstraction, but a practical shift in attention. It involves noticing the subtle layers of experience that often go unrecognized, the sensations within the body, the flow of thought, the quiet presence that observes without judgment. These layers, though less vivid than visual stimuli, carry a depth of information that can reveal aspects of reality that are otherwise overlooked. Consider how often we move through environments without truly registering them, our eyes scanning surfaces while our minds remain elsewhere. We see, but we do not perceive. We look, but we do not understand. This habitual mode of engagement creates a kind of perceptual inertia, where the familiar becomes invisible and the deeper patterns remain unnoticed. To step out of this inertia requires a deliberate shift, a willingness to pause and attend to what is not immediately obvious. The idea of actually seeing reality suggests that there is a more direct or authentic way of perceiving, one that is not bound by the limitations of surface-level observation. This does not mean abandoning the eyes, but rather transcending their dominance, allowing other forms of awareness to come forward. It is a rebalancing. A recognition that vision is only one aspect of perception, and that a fuller understanding arises when it is integrated with other modes of knowing. There is also an element of responsibility in this exploration. To see more deeply is to become more aware, and awareness carries with it a certain weight. It reveals patterns that may challenge existing beliefs. It uncovers connections that complicate simple narratives. And it invites a level of engagement that cannot easily be ignored. This is why the caution remains, not because the truth is dangerous in itself, but because it alters the way we relate to everything else. As we begin this journey, it is important to approach it not with urgency, but with curiosity. There is no need to force perception into new forms or to reject what is already known. Instead, the invitation is to expand, to gently explore the spaces beyond provisionist, to allow awareness to deepen at its own pace. The process is less about acquiring new information and more about refining attention, about learning to notice what has always been present but rarely acknowledged. In this way, the act of stopping the use of the eyes becomes less literal and more symbolic. It is a call to loosen the grip of habitual seeing, to question the assumption that appearance equals reality, and to open to the possibility that there is more to perceive than what is immediately visible. It is an invitation to step beyond the surface and into the depth, where reality is not just seen, but experienced in its fuller complexity. And perhaps, as this exploration unfolds, the most surprising realization will not be that the eyes have been deceiving us, but that they have simply been showing us one layer among many, a layer that is real, but not complete. If the invitation to stop using your eyes feels at first like a paradox, then the deeper themes that emerge from it begin to reveal why such a paradox is necessary. For the human mind, conditioned by repetition and reinforced by certainty, rarely questions the tools it uses most often. Vision has become so central to our understanding of reality that we seldom pause to examine its limitations, its biases, or its quiet tendency to shape the world into something more manageable than it truly is. And yet, when we begin to explore beyond this surface-level reliance, a series of fundamental concepts unfold, each one subtly reframing the relationship between perception and truth. At the core of this exploration lies the distinction between appearance and essence. What we see is often treated as synonymous with what is, but this equivalence is not as stable as it appears. The world presents itself through forms, objects, colors, movements, but these forms are not the entirety of their existence. They are expressions, manifestations of deeper processes that remain invisible to the eye. A tree, for example, is not merely the shape of its trunk and the spread of its branches. It is a living system of exchange, growth, and adaptation, much of which cannot be directly observed. In this sense, vision captures the outline, but not the full reality. This leads to a broader understanding of illusion, not as something false, but as something partial. Illusion is not the opposite of truth. It is a limited perspective that feels complete because it is familiar. When we rely solely on the eyes, we engage primarily with this layer of partiality, interpreting the world through patterns that prioritize clarity over complexity. The mind seeks coherence, and vision provides it, but in doing so, it often simplifies what is inherently intricate. To move beyond this simplification is not to reject what we see, but to recognize that it is one interpretation among many. Another central theme emerges in the relationship between perception and projection. The eyes gather information, but the mind organizes it according to prior experience, belief, and expectation. This means that what we perceive is not only shaped by the external world, but also by the internal frameworks we carry. Two people can look at the same scene and experience it entirely differently, not because the scene has changed, but because their interpretive lenses differ. In this way, perception becomes a dialogue between the outer and the inner, a continuous exchange where reality is co-created rather than passively received. This co-creation introduces the concept of perceptual filters, those subtle mechanisms through which information is selected, emphasized, or ignored. These filters operate largely beneath conscious awareness, guiding attention toward what is deemed relevant and away from what is not. They are shaped by culture, language, memory, and emotion, forming a complex network that influences how reality is experienced. To stop using your eyes in this context is to become aware of these filters, to notice how they shape perception, and to gently question their authority. There is also the theme of presence, which stands in contrast to habitual seeing. Much of what we perceive is processed automatically without deliberate attention. We move through environments, recognizing objects and navigating spaces with minimal conscious effort. This efficiency is useful, but it comes at a cost. The richness of experience is often reduced to a series of functional interactions. Presence, by contrast, involves a heightened awareness of the moment, a deliberate engagement with what is unfolding. It is not about seeing more, but about seeing differently, allowing perception to become more nuanced, more attuned to subtle variations that are usually overlooked. In this state of presence, a different kind of perception begins to emerge, one that is less dependent on visual dominance and more integrated with other forms of awareness. Sensation, for instance, becomes more vivid, revealing textures of experience that are not captured by sight. The feeling of air on the skin, the rhythm of breath, the subtle shifts in internal state. These are aspects of reality that exist independently of visual input, yet they are often overshadowed by it. When attention expands to include these dimensions, perception becomes more holistic, less fragmented. Another key concept is the idea of inner vision, which does not refer to imagination in the conventional sense, but to a deeper form of awareness that observes without relying on external stimuli. Inner vision is the capacity to perceive patterns, meanings, and connections that are not immediately visible. It operates in the space between thought and sensation, where insight arises not through analysis, but through direct recognition. This form of seeing is not bound by the limitations of the eyes, and it often reveals aspects of reality that cannot be articulated in purely visual terms. Interwoven with these themes is the notion of silence, not merely the absence of sound, but the quieting of mental activity that allows perception to deepen. The constant stream of thought can act as a barrier, overlaying interpretation onto experience before it has fully unfolded. When this stream softens, even momentarily, there is a space in which perception can occur more directly, less mediated by expectation. In this space, reality is not filtered through narrative, but encountered as it is, in its immediate presence. There is also a paradox at play. The more we attempt to grasp reality through effort, the more elusive it becomes. Vision, when driven by the need to understand or control, can reinforce this paradox, narrowing perception rather than expanding it. To truly see requires a certain relinquishment, a willingness to allow experience to reveal itself without forcing it into predefined categories. This is not passivity, but a different kind of engagement, one that is receptive rather than directive. As these concepts begin to interconnect, a larger pattern emerges. The act of seeing is not a single process, but a layered phenomenon involving sensory input, cognitive interpretation, and awareness itself. Each layer contributes to the overall experience, but none of them alone can capture the full scope of reality. To rely exclusively on one layer, particularly the visual, is to limit the range of perception, to confine experience within boundaries that may feel natural but are not absolute. The phrase, "watch cautiously," takes on new meaning within this framework. It is not a warning against perception, but a reminder to approach it with discernment, to recognize that what is seen is influenced by how it is seen, and that awareness of this influence can open the door to deeper understanding. Caution, in this sense, is not fear, but attentiveness, a careful observation of the processes that shape perception, and a willingness to explore beyond them. Ultimately, these themes converge on a single insight. Reality is not a fixed object waiting to be observed, but a dynamic field of experience that unfolds through interaction. The eyes provide one avenue of access, but they are not the only one. nor are they the most complete. To truly see is to engage with this field in a way that transcends the limitations of any single sense, allowing awareness to move freely across the layers of experience. And in doing so, something subtle begins to shift. The world does not change, but the way it is perceived does. What once appeared solid becomes more fluid, what seemed obvious reveals hidden complexity, and what was taken for granted begins to invite deeper inquiry. There are truths that resist direct explanation, not because they are obscure, but because they exist beyond the reach of linear thought. They move instead through story, through image, through the quiet language of symbol that bypasses argument and settles into recognition. When we attempt to understand what it means to stop using your eyes and to actually see reality, we inevitably arrive at this symbolic terrain, a landscape where meaning is not imposed, but revealed through patterns that echo something already known, though rarely acknowledged. Imagine a painter who has spent an entire lifetime perfecting the art of depiction. Every line is precise, every shade carefully measured, every detail captured with such fidelity that the paintings appear indistinguishable from the scenes they represent. People gather to admire the work, marveling at how accurately the world has been translated onto canvas. The painter, however, grows increasingly uneasy. For all the precision, there is something missing, something that cannot be captured no matter how refined the technique becomes. One evening, in a moment of quiet frustration, the painter closes their eyes while standing before an unfinished piece. Without the guidance of sight, the usual reference points disappear. There is no external form to replicate, no color to match, no structure to follow. At first, there is only uncertainty, but then, something unexpected occurs. In the absence of visual input, another kind of perception begins to emerge, subtle, diffuse, yet undeniably present. It is not an image, but a sense, a feeling of the scene that cannot be reduced to outlines or hues. When the painter finally opens their eyes again, the canvas is no longer approached as a surface to be filled with representation, but as a space to express what has been felt. The lines become less rigid, the forms less literal, and yet the result carries a depth that was previously absent. Those who view the painting cannot always explain why it feels different, only that it seems to contain something beyond what is seen. In this story, the painter represents the conditioned mind, trained to rely on visual accuracy as a measure of truth. The act of closing the eyes is not a rejection of skill, but a disruption of habit, a moment in which the dominance of sight is temporarily suspended, allowing another layer of perception to arise. The resulting transformation is not about abandoning vision, but about integrating it with a deeper awareness, one that perceives essence rather than surface alone. There is another narrative, quieter but equally revealing, that unfolds in the stillness of a forest. A traveler enters this forest at dawn, guided by a narrow path that winds between ancient trees. The light filters through the leaves, creating patterns on the ground that shift with every movement of the branches. The traveler walks with confidence, relying on sight to navigate, to distinguish the path from the surrounding undergrowth. As the day progresses, a dense fog begins to settle, gradually obscuring the landscape. The trees fade into indistinct shapes, the path becomes harder to discern, and the visual clarity that once guided each step begins to dissolve. At first, the traveler resists, straining to see, moving more cautiously, attempting to restore the lost certainty through effort. But the fog does not lift. It thickens, enveloping everything in a soft, impenetrable veil. Eventually, the traveler stops. There is a moment of hesitation, a quiet recognition that the usual method of navigation is no longer effective. In that pause, attention shifts. The focus moves away from the attempt to see and toward the experience of being present within the forest. The sound of leaves rustling, the subtle changes in the texture of the ground, the faint direction of the wind. These begin to offer guidance in a way that sight no longer can. Step by step, the traveler continues, not by forcing vision to return, but by allowing other senses to lead. The path is not seen, but it is felt. The direction is not observed, but it is intuited. And in this altered mode of perception, The forest reveals itself differently, not as a series of visible objects, but as a living environment that communicates through more than appearance. Here, the fog serves as a symbol of the limitations of sight, not as an obstacle to be overcome, but as a catalyst for transformation. It removes the dominance of the visual, creating space for other forms of awareness to emerge. The traveler's journey becomes less about moving through space and more about discovering a different relationship with perception itself. A third narrative unfolds not in the external world, but within the quiet interior of awareness. It begins with a simple act, observing a thought. At first, the thought appears as something solid, a clear statement or image that demands attention. It feels immediate, real, and often unquestioned. But if one remains with it, watching without engaging, something curious begins to happen. The thought, once so defined, starts to shift. It dissolves at the edges, revealing itself not as a fixed entity, but as a process, arising, changing, and fading. In this observation, a subtle distinction emerges between the content of the thought and the awareness that perceives it. The awareness remains constant, while the thought moves within it. This realization is not visual. It cannot be seen in the traditional sense. It is known through direct experience, through a kind of inner seeing that recognizes patterns without relying on external form. This narrative points to the possibility that reality itself may be experienced in a similar way. What appears solid and unchanging may, upon closer observation, reveal itself as dynamic and fluid, and the capacity to perceive this fluidity does not depend on the eyes, but on the quality of attention brought to the experience. Across these stories, a common thread becomes apparent: the shift from reliance on external sight to a more integrated form of perception. Each narrative illustrates a moment in which the usual mode of seeing is disrupted, creating an opening for something deeper to emerge. This disruption is not a loss, but a reorientation, a movement away from surface-level engagement and toward a more nuanced understanding of reality. There is also an underlying caution woven through these narratives. To see beyond the surface is to encounter complexity, ambiguity, and sometimes discomfort. The clarity provided by visual perception can be reassuring, offering a sense of stability and control. To move beyond it is to step into a space where certainty is less immediate, where meaning is not always fixed, and where perception requires a different kind of trust. This is why the invitation is framed carefully. It is not a demand to abandon sight, but an encouragement to question its dominance, to recognize that the eyes, while powerful, are not the sole arbiters of truth, that there are dimensions of reality that reveal themselves only when the habitual patterns of perception are gently set aside. In the end, these symbolic narratives do not provide definitive answers, nor do they seek to. Instead, they illuminate the pathways through which understanding can deepen, showing that the act of seeing is not confined to the visual, but extends into the very fabric of awareness itself. They suggest that reality, in its fullest sense, is not something to be captured, but something to be encountered through a mode of perception that is as much about presence as it is about observation. And in that encounter, the familiar begins to shift, not because it has changed, but because we have begun to see it differently. A movement from metaphor to reality is often where ideas either dissolve into abstraction or take root as lived experience. What has unfolded so far, the quiet dismantling of visual dominance, the invitation to perceive beyond appearance, the symbolic narratives that point toward deeper awareness, must now find its place within the ordinary flow of life. For if the insight remains confined to contemplation alone, it risks becoming another concept admired from a distance, rather than a shift embodied in the way we think, feel, and move through the world. To stop using your eyes in a practical sense is not to abandon sight, but to loosen its authority. It begins in moments so small they are almost imperceptible, yet over time, they alter the texture of experience. Consider the simple act of entering a familiar space, a room, a street, a workplace. Normally, the eyes scan quickly, identifying objects, confirming what is already known. The environment is recognized, categorized, and in a sense, dismissed as understood. But if in that same moment, attention is allowed to shift, Away from the immediate labeling and toward the subtle experience of being there, something changes. The space is no longer just seen, it is felt. The air has a quality, the silence a presence, the arrangement of objects a kind of silent dialogue. This is not imagination layered onto reality, but perception extended beyond the visual. It is a recognition that experience is multidimensional, and that vision, while useful, captures only one aspect of it. In practicing this shift repeatedly, the familiar begins to reveal depth, and the ordinary becomes a gateway to something more expansive. There is also a transformation in how we engage with thought. Much of our internal experience is visualized in subtle ways. Images, imagined scenarios, mental representations that carry the weight of reality. These internal visions often go unquestioned, guiding emotion and action as if they were direct reflections of truth. But when we begin to observe them with the same caution we apply to external sight, their nature becomes clearer. They are not fixed realities, but transient formations within awareness. By stepping back from these mental images, by noticing them without immediately believing or reacting, we create a space in which perception becomes more fluid. Decisions are no longer driven solely by habitual patterns, but informed by a broader awareness that includes, but is not limited to, what is seen or imagined. This shift does not eliminate thought, but it changes the relationship to it, allowing for greater clarity and less automatic reactivity. In relationships, the implications are equally profound. Much of how we perceive others is shaped by visual cues and the interpretations that follow. Facial expressions, body language, the immediate impressions that form within seconds. While these cues are valuable, they can also reinforce assumptions, leading to judgments that obscure deeper understanding. To see without the eyes in this context is to listen more fully, to attend not only to what is visible, but to what is expressed through tone, presence, and the subtle dynamics of interaction. This kind of listening requires patience, a willingness to remain open rather than rushing to conclusion. It invites a form of connection that is less about interpreting and more about receiving, less about projecting and more about recognizing. In such interactions, communication becomes richer, not because more is said, but because more is perceived beyond the surface of words and appearances. Work and creativity, too, are transformed by this shift. In environments that prioritize efficiency and output, perception often becomes narrowly focused, directed toward specific goals and measurable results. While this focus is necessary, it can also limit the emergence of new ideas, which often arise from less structured, more intuitive forms of awareness. When attention expands beyond the immediate task, when there is space to notice patterns, to sense connections that are not immediately obvious, creativity becomes less about effort and more about discovery. Artists, writers, and innovators often describe moments of insight as arriving unexpectedly, as if emerging from a place beyond deliberate thought. These moments are not dependent on visual analysis, but on a kind of receptive awareness that allows new patterns to form. By cultivating this receptivity, even in small ways, we create conditions in which deeper perception can inform practical action. Decision-making also shifts in subtle but meaningful ways. When guided solely by what is seen, data, outcomes, visible factors, choices can become constrained by the limits of available information. But when perception includes intuition, felt sense, and a broader awareness of context, decisions gain a different quality. They are not necessarily easier, but they are more aligned, reflecting a balance between analysis and insight. Of course, this integration is not without challenge. The habits of perception are deeply ingrained, reinforced by years of reliance on visual clarity and immediate interpretation. To step beyond them requires a certain patience, a willingness to move slowly where we are accustomed to speed, to remain with uncertainty where we are used to quick resolution. There may be moments of discomfort where the absence of familiar reference points creates a sense of disorientation. Yet within that disorientation lies the potential for a different kind of stability, one that is not dependent on constant visual confirmation, but grounded in a more direct experience of awareness itself. This stability is quieter, less obvious, but ultimately more resilient, because it is not tied to external conditions that can change. The caution embedded in the original invitation becomes especially relevant here. To expand perception is to encounter layers of reality that are not always simple or reassuring. It requires discernment, the ability to distinguish between deeper insight and mere projection, between genuine awareness and the mind's tendency to create new illusions. This discernment develops over time, through practice, through observation, through a continuous refinement of attention. In practical terms, this means returning again and again to the present moment, not as a concept, but as a lived experience. It means noticing when perception becomes rigid, when assumptions take hold, when the eyes dominate to the exclusion of other forms of awareness. And in those moments, gently shifting, allowing attention to broaden, to include what is felt, what is sensed, what is quietly known without being seen. Over time, these small shifts accumulate. They do not announce themselves as dramatic transformations, but they gradually alter the way life is experienced. The boundary between inner and outer softens. The distinction between observer and observed becomes less rigid, and reality begins to feel less like a fixed scene and more like a dynamic process in which we are intimately involved. In this way, the practice of seeing without the eyes becomes less about technique and more about orientation. It is a way of being in the world that values depth over immediacy, awareness over assumption, presence over habit. It does not reject the visible, but it places it within a larger context where it can be understood as one layer among many. And as this orientation takes root, something subtle but profound begins to unfold. The world remains the same, and yet it is experienced differently, not because new information has been added, but because the manner of perception has shifted. What was once taken at face value now reveals nuance. What seemed fixed now appears fluid, and what was overlooked begins to come into view, not through the eyes, but through a deeper, more integrated awareness. There is a quiet turning point that arrives not with spectacle, but with recognition. The kind that does not declare itself loudly, yet alters the entire orientation of how one moves through the world. After tracing the pathways from assumption to inquiry, from surface perception to deeper awareness, what remains is not a set of instructions, nor a final revelation, but a shift in relationship, a shift between the observer and the observed, between the act of seeing and the meaning we assign to what is seen. It is here, in this subtle reconfiguration, that the essence of "stop using your eyes, this is how you actually see reality" begins to settle, not as a concept to be remembered, but as a presence to be lived. At first, the invitation may have seemed paradoxical, perhaps even impractical. How can one stop using the eyes in a world so dependent on vision? But now, it becomes clear that the phrase was never about literal blindness. It was about releasing the unconscious dominance of sight as the sole authority of truth. It was about recognizing that perception is not a passive reception of reality, but an active engagement with it, one that can either narrow or expand, depending on how awareness is directed. Throughout this journey, a recurring theme has quietly woven itself through each reflection. Reality is not fixed, but relational. It is not simply out there waiting to be observed, but arises in the meeting between what is perceived and the awareness that perceives it. The eyes provide a gateway, but they do not define the entirety of the experience. They offer form, but not essence. They reveal shape, but not always meaning. And when we begin to see this distinction clearly, a different kind of freedom emerges. This freedom is not about escaping the world, but about engaging with it more fully. It is the freedom to question what appears obvious, to look beyond the immediate interpretation, to remain open to layers of understanding that unfold gradually rather than instantly. It is the freedom to pause, even briefly, before reacting, to notice the space between perception and response, where awareness has the opportunity to deepen. In that space, something remarkable happens. The world, once perceived as a series of separate objects and events, begins to feel more interconnected, more fluid, more alive. The boundaries that once seemed solid become more permeable, revealing subtle relationships that were previously overlooked. A glance is no longer just a glance. It carries tone, context, and unspoken meaning. A moment of silence is no longer empty. It becomes rich with presence. Even the act of breathing, so often ignored, becomes a direct experience of continuity, an unbroken link between inner and outer, between self and environment. This is where the transformation becomes tangible, not as a dramatic shift, but as a gradual refinement of perception. The eyes still function, the world still appears, but the way it is received changes. There is less urgency to define, less compulsion to categorize, less need to control what is seen. Instead, there is a growing capacity to remain with experience as it unfolds, to allow meaning to arise rather than forcing it into predetermined forms. Yet this transformation is not without its demands. To see more deeply is to become more aware of complexity, of ambiguity, of the limitations of certainty. It requires a willingness to live with questions that do not have immediate answers, to embrace a kind of openness that can feel unfamiliar, even unsettling at times. The caution that accompanied the original invitation now reveals its purpose, not as a warning against danger, but as a reminder that expanded perception carries responsibility. With greater awareness comes a greater sensitivity to the impact of our actions, to the ways in which perception shapes not only our internal experience, but our interactions with others and the world at large. When we see beyond surface appearances, it becomes more difficult to reduce people to simple categories, more difficult to ignore the nuances of context and intention. Compassion arises more naturally, not as an abstract ideal, but as a direct response to a more complete perception of reality. In this sense, the transformation is not only personal, but relational. It extends outward, influencing how we communicate, how we create, how we make decisions. It brings a subtle coherence to action, where what we do begins to align more closely with what we perceive at a deeper level. This alignment is not forced, it emerges as a natural consequence of seeing more clearly. And yet, perhaps the most profound aspect of this journey is its simplicity. For all the philosophical depth, all the metaphor and exploration, the practice itself returns to something remarkably accessible: attention, the willingness to notice, to pause, to question, to remain present. These are not extraordinary abilities reserved for a select few. They are inherent capacities, available in every moment, waiting to be engaged. The invitation, then, is not to become someone new, but to rediscover what has always been present. To recognize that the capacity to see beyond the eyes is not something to be acquired, but something to be remembered. It is already there, quietly operating beneath the surface of habitual perception, waiting for the moment when attention turns inward with enough sincerity to acknowledge it. There is no final destination in this process, no point at which perception becomes complete. Reality, by its nature, is dynamic, unfolding continuously in ways that cannot be fully captured or defined. To truly see is to remain in relationship with this unfolding, to engage with it not as a fixed object, but as a living process. It is to understand that clarity is not the absence of mystery, but the ability to move within it with awareness. And so, the call is gentle but persistent, not a command, but an invitation to experiment, to explore, to allow perception to expand beyond its Previshnay boundaries, to question what is seen without rejecting it, to trust what is felt without clinging to it, to remain open to the possibility that reality is far richer than it first appears. If there is a final insight to carry forward, it is this: the act of seeing is not confined to the eyes. It is an expression of awareness itself, a dynamic interplay between perception and presence. And when that awareness deepens, even slightly, the world reveals itself not as something separate, but as something intimately connected, an unfolding that includes the observer as much as the observed. In that realization, the distinction between looking and seeing begins to dissolve. What remains is a quiet clarity, a sense that reality has not changed, but that the way we meet it has. And in that meeting, something essential is remembered, not through effort, but through attention.